Good day. Of all the sections of Putin's presidential address to the Russian parliament, much the most tantalizing is certain comments he made about a coup or alleged coup attempt which took place in Belarus. Now, before I discuss that, I think that it's worth saying that over the last 12 months or so, Belarus has gone through strange, even tumultuous times. Just to recap, Belarus has for many years, ever since the mid-90s, been governed by the extraordinary personality of Alexander Lukashenko, who has become a virtually permanent fixture of the political scene, both in Belarus and in the former Soviet Union. Lukashenko is someone who blows hot and cold on relations with Russia. He was at one time talking about integrating Belarus into Russia. At other times, he flirts with the West. He is backed within Belarus by the Communist Party and has very openly and avowedly identified himself with Belarus's history as part of the Soviet Union. In Belarus, the October Revolution continues to be celebrated, and he has had an economic policy which, whilst actually in some ways fairly orthodox, nonetheless ensures that large parts of Belarus's economy remain under state control. He has even retained for Belarus retained the names of certain institutions. He's kept their Soviet names, so that, for example, Belarus's internal security agency is called the KGB. Nonetheless, it's important to say that Lukashenko has had, historically, a considerable amount of support within Belarus amongst people in the countryside and industrial workers, and the events of the last 12 months show that that support continues and remains solid. Anyway, let's recap what exactly has happened over the last 12 months so that we can then proceed to discuss the recent events, the extraordinary events of the alleged coup attempt. Briefly, events kicked off around a year ago with a very bizarre story that the Russians were attempting some kind of a coup against Lukashenko, and a group of mercenaries from Russia had gone to Belarus with the intention of staging this coup. These mercenaries were indeed rounded up by the Belarusian authorities at Minsk airport, and for a time it looked as if relations between Russia and Belarus were going to completely break down. However, it subsequently turned out that this was all a bizarre mistake, or not exactly a mistake. It seems that these Russian mercenaries had originally been contracted by a third party, which turned out to be Ukrainian intelligence, which was seeking to lure these mercenaries to Ukraine on the promise of contracts in places like Latin America and Africa in order to put them on trial there as part of an attempt by Ukraine to claim that these people had been fighting in eastern Ukraine and that their involvement proved the Russian government's participation in the conflict there. So after a great deal of diplomatic activity, these mercenaries were all returned to Russia. Relations between Russia and Belarus and between Russia and Lukashenko were patched up, and relations, by contrast, between Belarus and Ukraine, which had previously been fairly friendly, then began to deteriorate. Shortly after this rather odd event, there was an presidential election in Belarus, which, according to the official figures, President Lukashenko won with 80% of the vote. Now, I don't know anybody who takes that figure seriously. And there's been widespread speculation. In fact, in the Western media, it is practically a given that Lukashenko actually lost the election, and that the person who actually won the election was Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, who is a pro-Western candidate, as it subsequently turned out, and somebody with much more liberal views on many things than Lukashenko himself has. I'm going to say straight away that I've always been skeptical about this. I don't take the 80% vote that Lukashenko claimed he received at all seriously. I'm sure that is an imaginary figure, but I also think that it's likely that Lukashenko still has a critical mass of support in Belarus, and I've always believed that industrial workers and people in the countryside probably have continued to vote for him. My own guess at the time of the election, which I think events have borne out since, is that if Lukashenko did not win by 80% of the vote, he certainly won a majority and probably at the very least a plurality in that vote, and that he's probably supported by more people in Belarus than any other politician. Moreover, I think the events which have followed that election have almost certainly hardened his support. Anyway, the election result triggered protests in Minsk, which had clearly been prepared some time in advance, in anticipation that Lukashenko would claim a victory and then that victory would be disputed. The West, the United States, and especially the European Union strongly backed those protests. European diplomats actually participated in some of them, just as back in 2014 they participated in the protests in Ukraine, which eventually led to the overthrow of the then Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. However, it turned out that the protests were largely confined to a section of Belarus's middle class, concentrated in the capital Minsk, and to certain more Catholic areas in the west of the country. Importantly, attempts to persuade industrial workers to go out on strike proved a failure, and perhaps the turning point of the protests was when Lukashenko himself visited one of the factories near Minsk, spoke to the workers there, put up with some heckling, but managed to persuade the workers to stay at their jobs, which they did. In addition, the protests may have been, to some extent, quelled by the fact that it was clear that the Belarus police, especially the riot police, and the military and the security services in Belarus remained solidly supportive of Lukashenko, and that he had, in facing down those protests, the strong backing of Russia. At one point, President Putin even put together a special police and national security guard force and had it in readiness so that it could be sent to Belarus at great speed in order to help Lukashenko regain control of any government buildings on the assumption that they were stormed by the protesters. Incidentally, I believe that there was one attempt to storm a public building, namely the presidential building in Minsk, but that was turned back by Belarus's own riot police, so that attempt to storm that building never happened. I accept that is my own interpretation of events on a particular day, but I think that is what took place. Maybe others will disagree, but that's my view. Regardless, the protests failed to topple Lukashenko, and it became clear as the weeks progressed that he was securely in power. And in fact, over the course of the autumn and winter, the protests in Belarus slowly dwindled in size, and then they essentially stopped. I understand that from time to time, people still come out in Minsk in small numbers and protest against him, but there is no real sign that these protests are gaining traction with the wider population, and even those, many of those who supported the protests at the beginning have essentially given up on them. I would add that the fact that Tikhanovskaya, who was the presumed presidential candidate, went to Lithuania, left the country and went to Lithuania, and started making increasingly pro-Western statements, probably dimmed some of the support for her within Belarus also. Anyway, the situation seemed, therefore, in Belarus to have stabilized. And then over the last week or so, we started to receive reports about an attempted assassination of Lukashenko and a coup attempt there. And I'm going to say straight away that when I first heard these reports, I treated them with total skepticism. I said that I don't believe that Lukashenko actually won 80% of the vote in the presidential election last year, as he claims. And I assumed that Lukashenko, who has a habit of making up tall stories, probably was making up another tall story, posing once again as the heroic target of all sorts of nefarious persons, and perhaps using the talk of a coup and of an assassination attempt in order to bolster his position and enhance his popularity in Belarus and discredit even further the leaders of the protests against him by suggesting that they were in fact people who would resort to violence and terrorism and who were somehow aligned with the West. That's what I thought initially. And then the days have passed and I've begun to have some increasing doubts. Firstly, it's quite clear now that the Russians have been heavily involved in exposing and identifying this alleged coup that is supposed to have taken place in Belarus. And in fact, they've started to produce an increasing amount of evidence to back their claims. Now, it's important to make a point here about this evidence, which is that, of course, it has a Russian provenance, but at least the Russians are providing the evidence, or at least some of the evidence they say they have to back their allegations. One of the most exasperating things that happens in the West is that repeatedly the West claims that it has evidence of Russian malfeasance and malpractice, and then takes action against Russia in support of those various claims of Russian malfeasance or malpractice, but refuses to provide the evidence that supports that, claiming that it is classified and that to publish that evidence would somehow compromise intelligence sources or Western assets. This has happened time and again. It happened during the Litvinenko case way back in 2006. It happened over the Skripal affair. It happened over the Navalny affair, where the Germans initially said that they were going to provide the evidence about Navalny's poisoning and then failed to do so. And it's happened, by the way, again in connection with the recent events in the Czech Republic, where there's been an explosion at an ammunition dump, which the Czechs now say, 7 years after the event, were the work of Russia. So this sort of thing goes on often in the West. And by the way, the greatest example of this has been the Russiagate affair in the United States, where the US intelligence community made all sorts of outlandish and bizarre claims about Russian involvement in the 2016 election and Russian support for Donald Trump, but has never really backed them with any concrete evidence. So at least in this case, involving this alleged coup in Belarus, whatever you may think of the evidence, the Russians have at least provided some. And no doubt various people around the world are going to be trawling through this evidence over the next few weeks and months and perhaps years, and will try and work out how credible that evidence is. I'm going to say straight out and now that I have not done that, so I am not still making any absolute conclusions or coming to any definite conclusions about this evidence for the moment. Anyway, what this evidence appears to show is that there was an elaborate plot in Belarus which was supposed to be activated on the 9th of May. The idea was that Lukashenko himself would be assassinated during a military parade on the 9th of May, which Belarus and Russia celebrate as the anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Following that assassination, there would have been a major cut-off of communications in Minsk itself. Steps would have been taken to block the riot police and those sections of the military which would be assumed to be loyal still to the then government from acting to re-establish control, and that over the next few days and hours there would be a seizure of power in Minsk, and that would involve also the murder of several top-ranking officials of the current Belarus government and of members of Lukashenko's family. Now, that is all pretty wild stuff. Coups like that have taken place in parts of the world, but we haven't seen anything like that in Europe, or at least in Europe for some time. But this would have been a pretty astonishing event had it happened. The closest analogy I can think of is the events in Ukraine in February 2014. Well, I'll come to that shortly. Now, these very fantastic claims are, however, as I said, backed by evidence. And here's where it becomes interesting, because the evidence that the Russians have provided are transcripts of various discussions which the coup plotters, who have all been identified or are shown to have engaged in. And it seems that two of the coup plotters were lured to Moscow by Russian intelligence on a promise that they would meet there some dissident Belarusian generals, only that this was a sting operation prepared by Russian intelligence, and after they compromised themselves there by engaging in their various activities, they were promptly arrested. And it seems that there has now been a roundup of various people involved in the coup in both Belarus and Russia itself. Now, the other thing that is really very strange about this is that one of the alleged coup plotters, who I believe is based in the United States, has come out and denied that there was a coup, but has admitted that some of these very compromising and rather disturbing conversations, which include conversations about assassinations and seizure of buildings and that sort of thing, that he has confirmed that those conversations were true, but he has said that this was simply a case of people fantasizing and were not intended to be taken seriously. Now, I would quickly qualify what I've said is that I don't know whether that admission extends to all of these conversations, whether it extends to conversations about Lukashenko's assassination or the murder of other people, but at least this individual seems to have confirmed that some of these conversations really did take place. So we now have an accumulating body of evidence, which, as I've said, I've not been able to go through myself, and which has certainly not been fully tested in any courtroom, but which does seem to suggest that something serious did indeed take place, or was indeed planned to take place in Belarus around the 9th of May. Certainly, Lukashenko himself appears to think so, and more importantly, so does Putin. We've since learnt that Putin discussed the attempted coup in Belarus with President Biden in that telephone conversation, that now famous telephone conversation they had just over a week ago, in which it appeared that they were discussing principally the situation in Ukraine, and specifically, and over the course of which Biden told Putin that the United States would seek a predictable and secure relationship with Russia and offered a summit meeting. So now we come to the comments that Putin himself has made about this affair in his presidential address to the Russian parliament this week. And I'm going to quote them in full, and I'm then going to gloss them, because, in my opinion, these are in some ways quite interesting. So these are his words. Unfortunately, everyone in the world seems to be used to the practice of politically motivated illegal economic sanctions and to certain actors' brutal attempts to impose their will on others by force. Now, what he's referring to here, obviously, are the various attempts by the United States to impose sanctions on various countries, and also the various regime change wars, the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, the intervention in Syria, the intervention in Libya, and the rest. But then he goes on to say this: but today, this practice is degenerating into something even more dangerous. I am referring to the recently exposed direct interference in Belarus in an attempt to orchestrate a coup d'etat and assassinate the president of that country. At the same time, it is typical that even such flagrant actions have not been condemned by the so-called collective West. Nobody seemed to notice. Everyone pretends nothing is happening. But listen, you can think whatever you like of, say, Ukrainian President Yanukovych or Maduro in Venezuela. I repeat, you can like or dislike them, including Yanukovych, who almost got killed too and removed from power via an armed coup. You can have your own opinion of President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko's policy, but the practice of staging coups d'etat and planning political assassinations, including those of high-ranking officials, well, this goes too far. This is beyond any limits. Suffice it to mention the admission made by the detained participants in the conspiracy about a planned siege of Minsk, including plans to block the city infrastructure and communications, and a complete shutdown of the entire power system in the capital of Belarus. This actually means they were preparing a massive cyber attack. What could it be? You know, you cannot just do it all with one switch. Well, there we are. Quite a strong statement. And by the way, he added a little further down in his speech these words: what if there had been a real attempt at a coup d'etat in Belarus? After all, this was the ultimate goal. How many people would have been hurt? What would have become of Belarus? Nobody is thinking about this, just as no one was thinking about the future of Ukraine during the coup in that country. So, a number of very interesting points here. Firstly, let's go back to the fact that Putin is in effect admitting that a coup attempt did take place in Belarus, or at least confirming that, as far as he's concerned, a coup attempt did take place in Belarus, and that there was an intention to assassinate President Lukashenko as part of that coup. But notice a few rather interesting points about this. Notice these words: the recently exposed direct interference in Belarus in an attempt to orchestrate a coup d'etat and assassinate the president of that country. That is a clear signal that the Russians, and presumably the Belarus authorities also, believe that this coup attempt was orchestrated by one of the major Western powers, and that has to mean the United States. Note also these words. You can think whatever you like of, say, Ukrainian President Yanukovych or Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. A very interesting choice of leaders, because both Yanukovych and Maduro in Venezuela have faced coup attempts which have clearly been backed by the United States. In Yanukovych's case, obviously, that coup attempt succeeded. In Maduro's case, up to now, those repeated coup attempts have all failed. But what links those two cases together, Maduro and Yanukovych, is the involvement or participation of the United States in the events that took place in their respective countries. So by citing Yanukovych and Maduro, Putin is again clearly pointing at the United States as the relevant party. But then we get to what is perhaps the most interesting paragraph of all. Suffice to mention the admission made by the detained participants in the conspiracy about a planned siege of Minsk, including plans to block the city infrastructure and communications, and a complete shutdown of the entire power system in the capital of Belarus. This actually means they were preparing a massive cyber attack. What else could it be? You know, you cannot just do it all with one switch. Now, it's been very interesting that Putin is talking about a cyber attack, and he's talking here about a cyber attack in the context of a coup, which he is clearly saying the United States was responsible for orchestrating. These are his analyses. I want to stress they're not my own, but if you parse his words carefully, it's clear that's what he's saying. Because what makes it interesting is because a few weeks ago, we were actually reading in the American media that the United States was indeed planning a cyber attack, and that cyber attack would be in retaliation for certain steps the Russians had taken to interfere in the 2020 election and and because of their involvement in the SolarWinds hack. But we were told, as part of these reports, that this big cyber attack would be of a sort that would be invisible in Russia itself, at least to most people. And I have to say, I always found that extremely strange and very bizarre, because what would be the point of a cyber attack that nobody apart from a few officials in the Kremlin would know about? Well, I wonder, and this is again, I stress, purely a guess, if the talk of a cyber attack in the United States that we were reading about a few weeks ago was not about a cyber attack in Russia, but a cyber attack in Belarus, and that this is the cyber attack, the massive cyber attack that was being planned. And if the talk about a possible cyber attack on Russia might have been intended to distract Russian attention away from the events in Belarus and from the actual cyber attack which was being planned there, by getting Russia's various intelligence and security agencies, the ones that deal with cyber war activities, to prepare for a cyber attack in Russia, ignoring the fact that the real cyber attack would be in Belarus and not in Russia. Well, that's a guess. I don't know if that for a fact. It's a possibility. I'm not going to insist upon it. Anyway, let's move on to the next interesting part about this, which is the point that Putin has made about the fact that the United States and the collective West have said absolutely nothing about this coup at all. Now, this is really remarkable. I've been reading the British newspapers and I've been checking out the American media, and they're practically silent about this coup or alleged coup attempt in Belarus. There's been barely any reporting of it at all. I've seen a report, a incidental report on the website of Radio Liberty, which of course broadcasts to Russia, but I've hardly seen anything about this in the Western media. It's as if there is a complete media blackout about it. And of course, the readouts of the conversations between Putin and Biden, including the White House readout, say nothing about this at all. It's as if this conversation between Putin and Biden about Belarus, the part of that conversation, well, they don't want to talk about it at all. Now, that makes me wonder whether the Western powers aren't very embarrassed about this affair, and whether the word hasn't gone out to the media in the way that it can do, that this is a topic which is too hot to discuss and that which we would much rather not talk about. Again, that's possibly a guess. I don't know. I'm not sure. But it is strange that instead of the United States coming out strongly and denying its involvement in this coup attempt, in fact, ridiculing the whole idea that there was even a coup attempt, what we get instead is virtual silence. And then there is another very strange aspect about this affair, which is that, of course, this discussion that Putin makes about the coup or alleged coup or coup attempt in Belarus happens in the same speech in which Putin talks about Russia having red lines. And he talks very strongly, obviously, about this coup, or at least coup attempt in Belarus, as if implying that this, in some way, infringed those red lines. I wonder whether, in fact, Putin didn't say that explicitly in that conversation with Biden, which took place a short while ago, and whether the reference to red lines which Putin makes in this speech isn't partly intended to refer to the events in Belarus as well as the events in Ukraine. As to the events in Ukraine, I'm going to say something else. This is not based now on my theorizing. It's based on what certain people in the Russian media sphere have been saying, which is that there's now some speculation that the big event that was being planned for this spring and early summer was not a Ukrainian attack in the eastern Ukraine, but this coup in Belarus, and that this big build-up of forces that was taking place in Ukraine was intended to distract Russian attention away from what was actually being planned, which was this coup in Belarus. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. Who's to say? Maybe both were planned to happen at the same time. Perhaps it's all just coincidence. I'm not going to, as I say, go and try to analyze this more deeply. But the whole affair is very strange, and one does wonder what exactly is going on. It does seem, and I'm going to say this very carefully, as if something was indeed being planned in Belarus at around this time, and that it was whatever it was which was expected to happen was going to happen around the 9th of May. It does seem as if Russian intelligence and counterintelligence got wind of it and that the entire plot unraveled completely and disastrously. It does seem that this has been a major topic of discussion between the Russians and the Americans over the last few weeks, and it no doubt explains why Lukashenko is now tilting even more towards Russia than had been the case previously. He has recently been in Moscow, where he has been with President Putin, and where the two of them talked about the situation in Ukraine, and Lukashenko backed every word about Ukraine that Putin said. So, if this is true, then it could be that all of these events that have happened, the event in Ukraine, the event in Belarus, the strange episode in the Czech Republic, which I will discuss again in another video shortly, and of course the sanctions, whether this was all part of some attempt by someone, possibly in Washington, possibly somewhere else, to try to orchestrate a big push against the Russian government directly after the Biden administration took office. If so, and if it is true, if that is true, and if all this has unraveled in this spectacular way, with the West, the United States and the West underestimating the Russian response, both to events in Ukraine and to events in Belarus, then that might explain why the United States is now suddenly talking about the need for a predictable and stable relationship with Russia, and is talking about a summit meeting, and why Putin is talking about Russia insisting upon its red lines. If so, then this attempted coup in Belarus, together with the events in Ukraine, may have been a watershed moment in international relations. It may be, if you like, the peak moment of the neocon attempt to push against Russia, and a final admission on the part of some people in Washington within the US government that this thing has been taken as far as it can go, and from now on, some kind of relationship with Russia, accepting Russia as it is, and accepting that the Russians do have red lines, might now be necessary. Well, we shall see. But anyway, this is my rather speculative discussion about the events in Belarus over the last few weeks, based on this rather patchy and fragmented information that we have, and on President Putin's comments. Events will show to what extent they prove to be true. Thank you very much for joining me for this program on this channel. Please join us in other programs that we do in our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on join Alex rather on his channel. You'll find links under this video. Please join us on our various platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also support us to the extent that you can via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And remember, we accept donations and payments in all currencies, including the new ones, the new electronic ones. And last but not least, go to our Discord server and check out our shop. The wonderful things that you will find there, our amazing magic mugs, our t-shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, our sweatshirts, our hats, our hoodies, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me on this program, this long program on this strange and complex subject. And I look forward to you joining me in other programs about similar subjects in the future. And have a wonderful day until then.